Welcome to Tucker Carlson. Today there is so much volatility and perceived volatility going on in financial markets and in the economy more broadly, and a lot of it comes from the world of finance, which is a huge part of our economy all of a sudden. What exactly is finance? Who are the people who are benefiting from it? What is it exactly? So from time to time, since that's not our world at all, it's worth sitting down with someone who knows a lot about it. And John Lefebvre knows a lot about it. He worked at Salomon Brothers, Citigroup, he's an investment banker, he worked overseas, but he became famous to people outside his world for a Twitter account maybe 10 years ago that he started called Goldman Sachs Elevator, in which he roundly mocked and very incisively mocked the finance business. And he's done a lot since then. We want to sit down for an hour and ask him a whole bunch of questions. John Lefebvre joins us now. John, thanks so much for coming on.
Thank you, Tucker. I appreciate
it. So your Twitter account was, when it first came out, I'll never forget it, was like shocking to people and hilarious and interesting. How did you, so just start, like, who are you, where are you from, how did you get to the point where you became a public figure in writing that?
Okay, sure. I'll start from the beginning. So when I started the Twitter account, I was in Hong Kong. So if I back up from there, I started in investment banking straight out of college. Always wanted to go into investment banking as long as I can remember.
Where'd you grow up? I
grew up in Houston, Texas, and then went to boarding school and college on the East Coast. And
where'd you go to boarding school?
Choate Rosemary Hall.
Wallingford, Connecticut.
Wallingford, Connecticut.
Lovely Wallingford, Connecticut. And then you went to college on the East Coast also?
I went to college in Massachusetts, Babson College, and I read the book Liar's Poker in high school and college, and thought this is for me. Even going back to the Choate days, you know, we would have the dads from Greenwich, Connecticut come down with their Porsches, and
of course
they were the ones, you know, swearing too much and telling their kids not to obey. You know, there's a great line from the World War I, World War II hero, Sir Douglas Bader, who said, "Rules are for the obedience of fools and the guidance of wise men."
That's true, by the way.
And so these Wall Street dads would come down to Choate and tell their kids, you know, not to follow the housemaster's rules, and they'd be the ones that could take the SAT tests untimed. You know, they'd be the ones bending all the rules to benefit themselves. Well, I guess this is what I'm supposed to do. So
you come from Texas.
Rural Texas.
A town of 401, you said.
401.
You came on the air. And then all of a sudden you're right in the middle of this very northeastern world. Choate, Babson, and Boston.
Yeah, you know, my housemate is, you know, Prince Mohammed bin Turki Al Saud, and my other classmate is Ivanka Trump, and you have, you know, Carl Icahn's son, and, you know, a number of well-known kind of East Coast, you know, princelings, for lack of a better term.
So it's a completely different world from the one you grew up in.
Yeah, go home and you're surrounded by cows and horses.
But it seems like going into investment banking is the way to, I mean, that's the ladder you ascend.
Well, it's part of the family that I came from. I mean, I came from a relatively affluent, finance-oriented family. We just happened to grew up. You know, I happened to grow up in Texas. I'm not, you know, a redneck.
Yeah.
A redneck. I don't use that term to denigrate people, because
not at all.
You know, I love rednecks, but I did not come out of, you know, redneck Texas. I mean, I came from an affluent, finance-oriented British New York family that just happened to have raised me in Texas.
So why did you go into investment banking?
It seemed exciting to me.
Yeah.
You know, you read Liar's Poker, and I guess it's complicated for a couple reasons. It seemed exciting to me. You know, you're surrounded by ambitious, smart people. You're well-resourced. You get to work on transactions that make the Wall Street Journal. All of that, to me, is alluring. But beyond that, I found, and I think this applied to me and also, more broadly speaking, what I saw when I got to banking, it was a bunch of, again, smart people, but they didn't really know what they wanted to do, and perhaps they didn't have the gumption or courage to go out and try something entrepreneurial. You know, in worst case scenario, in 20 years, you can retire at, you know, 45, and, you know, as we talked about before coming on the air, live in Greenwich, Connecticut, and have the white picket fence and send your kids to Choate, which again is not something I would want or aspire to today, but at the time, that
Yeah,
was
you're a young man. You don't know.
That was the process that.
So what did you discover when you got there?
I thought that, first of all, the job was not rocket science. And I thought that...
Really?
It was...
Oh, John, I think it is rocket science, though. That's what I've heard.
Well, exactly. It layered into that, these guys and gals, whatever, people, they take themselves far too seriously. They define themselves as human beings based on what they do for a living. And, what bank, whether you're at Goldman Sachs or Morgan Stanley or, God forbid, J.P. Morgan, the hierarchy within the banking, it's a bizarre world that you just kind of get sucked into. In fact, when I used to visit Texas from Hong Kong, I came home out of this warped world. This is God's honest truth. My mother would say, I'm going to drop you off at Walmart and just walk around for like 10, 15 minutes and just reacclimate to the pace and the kind of IQ level and the expectations of kind of the real world, because it's not, investment banking Hong Kong or Singapore here. It's completely.
Well, I love your mom. She sounds like a great person.
Yeah.
Did it work?
Eventually.
So it wasn't as impressive as you thought?
No. It was the opposite. And so I was always very, very cynical. So I thought, I came into this world because of the book Liar's Poker. Eventually, I want to leave this world. I'm not quite sure how or when or why. But I will probably write a book about it. And so I started collecting stories right when I first started. And I was fortunate in that I started right after the dot-com bubble burst. So, I was an intern in 99 and 2000, and then I joined Solomon Brothers, then part of Citigroup, in 2001, which was the largest incoming analyst class in banking history because they had overhired before fully realizing the extent of the dot-com crisis. And then, of course, that bled straight into Enron. So I started in New York and then went to London and then Hong Kong in that period between the dot-com bubble and then through the great financial crisis. And so I thought that my vantage point was relatively unique and credible, from which I could opine and, based on my experiences, opine on kind of the world that I saw. So this, I guess, is a long-winded way of answering your initial question, which was how I got to the Twitter account. I was in Hong Kong, and after the crisis in 2010, at Citigroup, my boss from London and boss from Hong Kong, we started a boutique capital markets firm focused on emerging markets advisory. I think the premise being that after the crisis, the big banks would step away in terms of banking the smaller emerging market entities, because it was too time intensive. I mean, why would you spend 6 months gestating an Indonesian coal transaction, when you could do a deal in 24 hours for the Korean Development Bank? And so the big banks went in one direction, and we decided that there was a niche, in the kind of SME space. So I did that for about a year, and then I was lured back into banking by Goldman Sachs. So I was hired by Goldman Sachs to run their Asian syndicate business on the debt side. And a month into my...
Can I ask you to pause for a second?
Yeah.
What does on the debt side mean for people who don't follow this?
The bond market.
Okay.
So, in simple terms, you think of kind of equities or debt. So if a company wants to borrow money, we would help them raise money, which I think is important to understand, because it does speak to that vantage point. So if, say, Ford wants $1 billion, they would go to Citigroup and say, we want $1 billion. And they wouldn't just go to Citigroup, they would go to, say, 2 or 3 banks or book runners on a transaction. So Citigroup, Goldman Sachs, and then maybe Barclays or Deutsche Bank, a European bank, who would distribute the bonds globally. And those banks would then go out to the buy side to take orders and syndicate that $1 billion. And they would raise the money from the investors, take a small fee, and then give Ford their money. So that would be, hedge funds, pension funds, asset managers, people like that. So that function, basically, where I sat, so there are hundreds of thousands of investment bankers that serve a variety of roles. But the syndicate desk specifically is the middle point that sits above the Chinese wall, which, if you're not familiar with the term Chinese wall, which is the invisible wall that protects basically the private side of a bank. So that's where you have material non-public information. So if you're working on a merger or an acquisition or a fundraising, that's market-sensitive information that, if known to the market, would impact, the prices of public security.
Yes, and people go to jail, too.
People do go to jail. So the syndicate desk is one of the few seats that sits above the Chinese wall, because you have to bridge that gap between material, non-public information and public markets. So my clients were the buy side, so the hedge funds and asset managers who needed to invest their money, and the sell side, so any company or entity that wanted to borrow money. So I would bridge that gap. So it was a fairly unique and, I think, credible vantage point, in that I worked with all aspects of the bankers and their kind of sell side clients, and the salespeople and the traders and their buy side clients. And then you worked with, you worked with every bank on Wall Street. So even though I spent most of my career at, say, Citigroup, I did dozens and dozens of transactions with Morgan Stanley and JP Morgan and Goldman Sachs and Deutsche Bank and Barclays and every bank in the world. And I did that in New York, London, and Hong Kong. And so that's how I kind of got into the situation where I thought, well, I want to write a book about this. So I had joined Goldman Sachs and after the crisis, and my partner sued me by imposing the non-compete clause in the contracts that we had set up. So I was prevented from joining Goldman Sachs because of the non-compete clause in my contract. And so they paid me to just not work for a year. So I was just sitting in a bar in Hong Kong with some friends when the Occupy Wall Street started.
What'd you think of that?
We were just amused. I mean, we had the same thing. They came. It was a global phenomenon. It was in London. It was in Asia. I mean, I think it was a kind of trivial, aimless. I can't think of a word that is perhaps kosher for the show, but it seemed all a bit pointless. But there was obvious frustration, and from where I was sitting, and to us, it was more than anything, it was just amusing. And so that's kind of how the Twitter account started, because I said to my friends, I said, well, if they really knew, this is what they think, and they don't have a clue, and not just as it relates to corruption and deviance, systemic conflicts of interest. I mean, the whole system is completely rotten in terms of how we used to, allocate deals and trade favors and, move money around. It was completely corrupt. That aside, just in terms of what I thought would be kind of red meat to the Occupy Wall Street crowd, which was the sexism and the classism and the racism and the misogyny, the flippant disregard for money, the overall odiousness of the culture. I thought they don't have a clue. And so that's how I think I started.
So if a guy from Wall Street says in his mind, the Occupy Wall Street people think this is bad, but they don't know how bad, that suggests it's pretty bad.
Well, I think my first tweet was something like, and this got copied by somebody well known, so I don't know if I ever got credit for it, but my first tweet was something like, my garbage disposal eats better than 98% of the world, or something like that, or or it was every time my girlfriend offers me a sexual favor, I know it's time to check my Amex statement. Intentionally satirical, a reflection of the culture.
But were the attitudes actually kind of like that?
100%.
Really?
If you look through the original tweets, a lot of the stuff obviously was created to reflect and opine on the culture in kind of an illuminating way, and it was satirical, but there was substance behind the satire. So a lot of what is in there, and certainly 100% obviously of what I wrote about in the book, is completely true.
What did Goldman Sachs think?
Well, that was, I think, somewhat misunderstood, because the name Goldman Sachs Elevator was simply an homage. At the time, you had Matt Taibbi. He wrote a big article for Rolling Stone about Occupy Wall Street, and he coined the phrase vampire squid, which really stuck as it relates to kind of Goldman Sachs. And so the name Goldman Sachs Elevator was a bit arbitrary. I mean, in essence, the character worked at Citigroup and JP Morgan and Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley. It just happened to be under that kind of character.
Do you think?
But they had, but it rang so true. Apologies for interrupting.
Yeah, no, please.
It rang so true that they had started a internal investigation to find out if the quote unquote culprit was actually inside their offices.
So from the outside, and I truly am way on the outside, I know nothing, but Goldman does seem unusually repulsive.
That's actually part of the reason why I picked the name. So
is that true?
Completely true. So when I was working, the difficult thing about Hong Kong, or not necessarily the difficult thing, but the interesting thing about the Hong Kong dynamic in banking is that you have obviously the expat community, and then you have the banking community. Everything kind of layers on top of each other, because Hong Kong in essence is a tropical island that masquerades as a legitimate city. So all the Westerners and all the white guys, everyone, you don't even know who's a client, who's a friend, who's a colleague. Everyone goes to the American club or the cricket club or the Mandarin Oriental. So it's a very incestuous, clubby world. And so all of my friends were and all of my clients were my friends, but we were all at the big banks. We would all do the same things socially together. And one of the things that really struck me in particular about the people at Goldman Sachs, and I spoke to this earlier, but they really define themselves as human beings by the fact that they work at, not just in finance, but they work at Goldman. It defines them to their core.
I mean, they're proud of it?
They probably couldn't exist without it.
That's just odd, because I think normal people think very little of Goldman Sachs. Goldman Sachs seems like a huge problem, a cancer on the earth.
Well, I mean, I think you can create these bubbles, and it relates to, corporate media and politics and everything else. They really, you create these bubbles where nothing else matters. A very insular world, and your benchmarks and everything you measure is contained in that.
So like, what does the average Goldman Sachs guy think he's doing on this earth?
Making the world a better place for themselves.
Really? So there's no pretense of anything else?
No, not in my experience. Now, everything was a joke. I mean, I'll give you an example. We would do conference calls where, especially during the crisis, when markets get dislocated and frozen, no deals happen, but you still have to go through the motions. And so we would take clients, and they're trying to raise hundreds of millions of dollars that arguably change, for a small emerging market company, it's transformational. And to us, it was often, a joke. I would be on calls with, say, somebody from Deutsche Bank, and they were, daily market update calls. And again, it was a transformational transaction for this company. But for us, it was just another deal. And we knew that the markets, in times of, dislocation, these deals weren't happening anytime soon. And we would get so bored. One day I would pretend to be the guy from Deutsche Bank, and he would pretend to be the guy from me. So I would put on a British accent, and he would put on a caricature of a Texas accent, and we would just switch roles and switch banks, and mic in barnyard sounds into. I mean, everything was a joke. If our bonus was decided, bonus numbers get set in, say, initial round October and then evolved into kind of November, December. If our bonus numbers were set in November on a good year, we would intentionally tell clients, sorry, market can't handle this deal right now. Q1 next year is a good window. Hundreds of millions of dollars for this company. And our bonus was already set, so we would convince them that there was bad timing. You got to wait until.
Because you just didn't feel like doing the work.
We wanted to count towards next year's bonus. Our bonus was already set.
Oh.
Out of self-interest. We would just kick it into next year because then we would get paid for it.
Were there any incentives not to behave selfishly?
No. And I tried to write about, and that's what I think is also misunderstood. If someone had read my book, it's written in a very kind of, it's 100% true and, nonfiction, point to point. I mean, we had lawyers vet every aspect of the book, but it's written in an intentionally unlikable voice. So if someone read that, they would think that I am a complete asshole, for good reason. And and perhaps that is probably true of the person I was when I was living through those things. So objectively, I was and deserving of any and all of those criticisms. But I wanted to kind of opine on the odiousness of the culture without kind of having that moralistic epiphany. So the book is very unapologetic, but the voice in the book is very unlikable, and for good reason.
So correct me if I'm wrong, because you would know and I wouldn't necessarily, but my sense is the shine has gone off investment banking and the culture has changed and probably gotten worse, but in a very different way. It now seems very beta, big business, DEI,
ESG,
HR's running everything kind of thing, and like people are just cowering like they work at IBM in 1970 or something.
It's a shadow of its former
Is that
self.
true, do you think?
Completely true. It's very beta, very DEI, very algorithmic tech driven. I mean, the superstars on Wall Street are from New Delhi and Mumbai now. They're not from they're not lacrosse players from Harvard.
And never will be again.
Never will be again. And again, I succeeded, I think, a lot of times because, I was good at drinking and keeping secrets and could play golf. And so if there was, and that's how the world worked, right? So if there was a managing director and we potentially could get stuck on the tarmac in, Cleveland, Ohio, I'm not a bad person to sit next to. Or if we have an extra day to kill in Madrid and, want to go play golf, then, I'm your guy. And that's the interesting thing, because I always found that in talking, and not to try and pivot your own show, but
no, I'm take it away.
I've always been a big critic of this idea of the gender pay gap, right? If women really got paid, 15 cents less, then a shareholder conscious company would just hire women and save much money. It's obviously, and there are obviously, pundits, like Christina Hoff Sommers, who I'm sure you know of, it can speak eloquently to that. That notion is completely a joke. Having said that, I did find, at least in my personal experience in banking, if I compared myself to, say, a female peer, again, the trading floor on Wall Street is a very toxic environment. So, for example, the hedge fund desk would hire women, and they would hire them based purely on looks, and they would call them tethered goats.
Tethered goats?
At Citigroup,
like bait.
Bait. And they would take them out for drinks with hedge fund managers and go drinking with hedge fund managers, and the next day, the hedge fund managers would call and throw them a couple of trades and get their, get them some money. We had this actually, the reason I mention this is because it's funny to me. The current, I don't want to mention him by name specifically, but he's still a managing director. He leads the ESG effort at a global investment bank, my first boss. He came to me one morning on the trading floor, and he never interviewed the incoming analyst. And he looked at a resume, and it said Glamour Magazine's Woman of the Year. And he said, I'm definitely going to interview her. Off he goes. He never interviewed. You have to interview a lot of people when you work at a bank, but never interviewed anybody. An interview is about 45 minutes to an hour. He comes back 10 minutes later. I said, what happened? I thought you were interviewed. He goes, yeah, I interviewed her. I guess looks weren't among Glamour's criteria. Interview over. And of course, the whole trading floor just erupts with laughter. I mean, that's the joke. And I thought it was funny being part of that culture. But even if you didn't think it was funny, you have to think it's funny because, your boss's jokes are always, the guy with his card behind the bar is always the most entertaining person.
Of course.
Your boss's jokes are always funny. So as it relates to the kind of that culture in terms of its complete odiousness, if I looked at myself and my ascension through my analyst and associate years, I feel like I was given opportunities, as I said, because I could play golf or drink or play backgammon, or in particular, you go to a city like Amsterdam, keep secrets where.
Yeah.
And again, I got criticized for saying this on one of your colleagues' shows when my book came out, but I think because, and I won't name the host, but I think her husband was a banker, and I had said that any banker out of New York doing a road show in Asia, wedding rings are always optional, and that's just how the culture is, and
I knew that.
It's it's completely toxic. So when I started, I was good at all of those things, and so I was put on more deal teams. I was closer to more senior people, exposed to more clients.
You haven't mentioned math among the job.
Doesn't matter at all. Does not matter at all. I don't even think I'm particularly good at math. I mean,
so I could do this job?
You'd probably be excellent at it. I mean, it's
shallow, aggressive, perfect.
In an alternate universe, Hunter Biden is the head of Goldman Sachs.
Yeah, no.
Without that's all it takes. But my point was that I would be put on more deal teams, and over time that would kind of snowball, such that my resume perhaps internally would look better than one of my female colleagues who perhaps couldn't drink or play golf or couldn't go out without getting sexually harassed. So I could get promoted more quickly in that type of environment than perhaps. And I mean, that goes both ways too, right? I mean, obviously a young, attractive 22-year-old gets probably promoted even more quickly than me. But it is reflective of the kind of locker room culture that Wall Street embraced.
It doesn't sound like a very efficient business, actually, from what you're describing.
You don't mess with money. And I think that's why Wall Street hasn't really had a Me Too problem. Hollywood, you wouldn't think you would mess with money in Hollywood, but, Harvey Weinstein can pick who wins the Academy Award.
Right.
I mean, that's fairly arbitrary.
Yeah.
And obviously in D.C., there have been episodes of Me Too, but Me Too has not touched, and Me Too has hit tech in a way, but Me Too has not touched Wall Street. You don't mess with money. So we were very serious. I mean, I have perhaps a cavalier attitude about things, but when I was an analyst and an associate, I worked 6-7 days a week. Markets open to market close. Worked on weekends. We would go out. And sometimes I would go straight to the office from having been out all night the night before. And in a place like Wall Street, that's almost applauded. I mean, I think we had an awards dinner when I was in London, and I showed up to work in my dinner jacket from the night before, and I got a round of applause.
Yeah.
And you would think that perhaps you would get admonished for that.
No, I think men appreciate the ability to play through.
But yeah, we didn't mess with money. So we did, obviously the joking around and silliness and things like that. But when it came down to it.
Well, speaking of not messing with money, you just reminded me of a story I saw last week where the Attorney General of the Virgin Islands
resigned or got fired.
For trying to indict J.P. Morgan for its involvement with Epstein. What do you make of that?
I mean, J.P. Morgan obviously knew who Jeffrey Epstein was. But it's not just J.P. Morgan. I mean, I don't understand how this doesn't get more attention. So, for example, Jeffrey Epstein got a sweetheart deal serving house arrest for the rape of children.
Yeah.
And he is released from jail. And who throws him a get-out-of-jail party? Katie Couric and George Stephanopoulos.
What?
Yeah, you can look it up. They hosted a big. I mean, everybody knew this guy was a pedophile.
Katie Couric and George Stephanopoulos hosted a get-out-of-jail party for Jeffrey.
Well, it wasn't officially a get-out-of-jail party, but when he got out of jail, he went to New York, threw a big party with Prince Andrew, Katie Couric, George Stephanopoulos, Chelsea Handler. Guy just got out of jail for raping children. So it's not just J.P. Morgan. It's the corrosiveness of. I mean, again, it's part of the reason why now I'm happier in rural Texas than I am in New York City. And perhaps the same goes with.
What did you make? So over all of these banks is the Fed. So what did you make of the Fed? I mean, what role did it play in your mind day to day in your business, if any?
At that time, very little. But in the last 10 years, I mean, they've been like a drug dealer. I mean, we're going to pay the price for what the Fed's cavalier attitude towards just printing money over the last, 11, 12 years. And it's going to be, I think, in my opinion, very, very ugly. I don't think inflation is transitory. I think the prospect of a very serious recession is perhaps even understated. It's very scary. I mean, we could, like I said, in 10 years we could have, social unrest, and thank goodness I've got, land and guns, because it could get very ugly, and those seeds were sown by the Fed over the last 10 years.
Did you know it at the time?
No.
So you were working at banks, and we have this recession.
It's like an addiction. I mean, it's an addiction. I mean, they're creating the smooth waters for sailing.
So I guess it's another way of asking: did you or any people you work around think of the larger economic?
Nobody cares.
They don't.
No. You're completely. All you care about is what you're going to get paid that year.
That's it.
That's it.
Did people, I mean, this is, I guess, a stupid question, but did anyone at these American banks consider themselves American in any real sense?
In terms of patriotism?
Yeah.
No. And that's actually one of the things that I find quite surprising. I've been generally politically and philosophically conservative most of my entire life. There was a big divide between me and my kind of group of friends from the banking community with the ascension of, say, Donald Trump. I mean, it was something that I predicted and kind of enthusiastically supported, and I meant that sincerely, but also kind of nihilistically. It was entertaining, and I supported it for kind of the spectrum.
But when you say you predicted it, can you just flesh it out a little bit?
Sure.
A Trump-like figure.
Yeah. So I was in Hong Kong and prevented from working, and I just spent the year traveling and partying and having fun. And that was when I decided to move back to Texas and focus on family and kind of get back to reality and write a book and do something. I was done with the industry. And the part of the reason for that was we had been involved in a real estate transaction that was seller financed in Houston, and we had to foreclose on it. And it was a very successful restaurant that had been just mismanaged. And we looked at the value of the note that was owed. It's like $800,000 versus what was effectively a turnkey successful restaurant to recreate would probably cost, $2.5–3 million.
Right.
So it was a no-brainer. And so I decided to get into the restaurant business overnight. And I thought, okay, I'll be here from when it opens until when it closes, and I'm going to sit in this corner of the bar, oversee everything, and I'm going to write my book. And that was effectively...
Wait, so you went from working at an international investment bank in Hong Kong to sitting in a restaurant?
It's more dramatic than that. It's more dramatic than that. So, I mean, if you think about it, this is having, champagne brunch at the Mandarin Oriental, debating, who has the best business class lounge at, Kuala Lumpur Airport, or, if the Four Seasons delivers a better Thanksgiving catering service in Singapore than the Ritz-Carlton. This stupid, vapid stuff. So I went within a period of weeks from brunch in Hong Kong to sitting in the back of a Ford F-150 in the parking lot of a restaurant with illegal immigrants, with people who had been in prison, people who forget not even having passports. Some people who had never been on an airplane. I mean, the variety of people that you get that work in a restaurant, from back of the house to the front of the house. And so within a period of weeks, I was very hands-on. So we would work, and then we'd shut the restaurant down, and I would assess it like I would any other investment. So I would sit in the back of the truck with the cocktail waitress and the bartender and the cook and the cleaner and drink Bud Light until 1 o'clock in the morning and hear about their lives. And I think that was the point when I realized that there was a lot more substance in that group of people or people like that than there was having brunch with a bunch of Ivy League grads in Hong Kong or, sitting at the Greenwich Country Club listening to some guy tell racist jokes.
This is totally far afield, but of all the, you said Ivy League grads you dealt with, is there one school that jumps out as producing particularly unimpressive people?
Brown.
Chips
on shoulders.
Really? Because it's not really an Ivy League.
It's not really an Ivy school. I would say, who knows statistically, but a huge percent. It's all nepotism.
Totally.
It's a inbred nepotism. Kids of faculty
of famous people.
Yeah, Brown. You go visit it. It's
that's what I think.
Tedious to visit. It's no fun. There's nothing redeeming about Brown. And then probably Cornell.
That's exactly what I was going to say. Brown, Cornell, just for unimpressiveness. Sorry to interrupt. So you're all of a sudden drinking beer in the back of your truck with dishwashers, and that changed your view politically?
Well, I've always been fairly conservative, but
it's a different kind of conservative, though, the Trump thing.
Oh, absolutely. So when Trump came along in 2015, I think it was probably mid-2015 when famously, even I think either before or just after the famous escalator scene where Ann Coulter went on Bill Maher and was famously laughed and mocked for predicting that Donald Trump was the most viable candidate. And I think I was in complete agreement. I could see it. I could feel it.
Me too.
And even, I think it was most succinctly summarized, ironically, by Michael Moore in the speech that he gave in Detroit about a month before the election, where he basically said Donald Trump was the Molotov cocktail that, Joe Blow and Billy Blow and Johnny Blow could throw at the establishment, and they didn't. I felt that to my core, which again is why my support for Trump, I think, was sincere, but also had a kind of a nihilistic component to it. Because
you were that mad at the establishment.
Yeah, absolutely. Sincerely mad, and then also kind of perhaps a trollish, nihilistic component to it that just I thought was just funny.
Yeah, you went to boarding school.
I don't care.
I get it.
Yeah.
I get it. And he is hilarious. I mean, leaving aside everything else, like Trump is
absolutely
funny.
I love the guy. Yeah.
But did you start to get a sense, and I'll admit I didn't have the sense until much later in my life, I'm embarrassed to say, but that the economy really is, that the dummies on the left were right about one thing, the economy, it really is lopsided. Like a small number of people do benefit disproportionately, and a lot of people get kind of shafted.
Absolutely. I mean, and there's no hope. I mean, and I've got young kids now. I mean, it's sad to say, I don't see how things get necessarily better. I mean, my children are 8 and 9, and I sincerely believe that forget the fact that I would never send my children to a school institution like Choate.
Why?
It took me 20 years to recover from that process, and I went to Choate in the late 90s. Now it's pure, alphabet indoctrination and, DEI, social justice. I mean, I wouldn't even be able to function at a school like that.
Yeah.
And I would be upset if my child was not expelled from that school immediately for raising his hand and calling out a teacher for clear, insanity. I mean, without question. But in reality, where my children go to school, I don't think will matter in 10 years. What they do for a living, I don't think will matter. I mean, I think that...
Why do you say that?
Because I don't see a fix for the trend of inequality. So I think for me personally, it literally is about having, diverse income streams hard assets, land and guns. I mean, that's my 10, 15-year vision. And it's almost like an insurance policy. I mean, I think if things, and this is certainly true for China, and I think it will happen in China, and it's possibly, well, certainly it's in terms of a probability, it's something that's worth worrying about, is that you could have, such inequality in the next generation that you could have social unrest in this country. And that will happen first in China, without question. But I think it could very well, it's certainly worth factoring into your life decisions in the United States, because I don't see things getting better.
No, we will have, inequality produces social unrest. Envy enrages people, and unfairness. So I want to get to this, which is, I didn't even know that you did this until today, and I was reading the packet. So you wrote a 99-step guide on how to be a man.
Yeah.
Before I go through some of these, why did you write this?
Well, so I started the Twitter account with kind of having in mind that I wanted to write a book. And I'm not a writer. I don't consider myself a writer, but I thought that would be a good tool to, eventually promote the book. So I built up a following of over 1 million followers ahead of my book coming out across Twitter and Facebook and Instagram and all that stuff, just to promote the book. Part of that kind of stepping stone was to prove out that I could move out of the Twitter character in 140 characters into longer form content. So that's why I had started writing silly, I guess it's a combination of satire, humor, and genuinely good advice. And so, rules to live by, I think I wrote, airplane etiquette, bar etiquette, dating advice, fashion etiquette. Actually, my fashion article is part of the reason why I ended up getting into the fashion business. So I use that as a stepping stone for longer form content. And, it was just, at the time, very, very popular. So it was getting, millions and millions of views. But the How to Be a Man, I think I just wrote it cynically because I thought that if you look at the deterioration of, say, GQ and Esquire magazine over the last, 2 decades. I mean, I subscribed to Esquire and GQ when I was in high school. And if you read it now, it has gone, completely woke.
I used to write for it. So it's beyond belief. Wouldn't allow it in my home.
Exactly.
Because it's disgusting.
And so I had looked at some of the content that was out there for that demographic. And so I think one of the things that's interesting about my follower base as it relates to the book and the Twitter account is it attracts a lot of kind of older, educated, kind of free-thinking people who understand satire and appreciate the illumination. But at the same time, it attracted aspirationally a lot of young, kind of the young frat bro demographic who perhaps didn't understand the satirical component to it, but had looked at it aspirationally, like, oh yeah, I want to go work on Wall Street. This is awesome, and so I started writing that content to appeal to that kind of younger.
Well,
demographic.
your list, the 99 pieces of advice, they're funny. They're actually, some of them are wise in my view. I want to read through a few. Some I just love. Need no explanation. Never stop dating your wife. Keep doing what you did to get her in the first place. Amen. Don't let your job define you as a person.
That was my experience.
And my personal favorite, stop talking about where you went to college.
Yeah,
at what age can you stop?
You run around the reservoir in Central Park, how many college shirts do you need to look at? It's very tedious, isn't it?
It's very tedious, and bless you for saying that. Appreciate your parents. When they die, you become an orphan. I love that. Act like you've been there before. What does that mean?
Well, it goes back to Earl Campbell, Houston Oilers running back in the 70s, obviously before my time. But he never celebrated a touchdown. I said, Earl, don't you celebrate? He said, no, my dad told me, act like you've been there before. So, you want to go on a private jet? I don't need to see a picture of it. Act like you've been there before. You want to take a picture.
Never take a picture of yourself on a charter flight. There's something about that that's just like the worst thing.
But even in California, I think I was in Redondo, and these Instagrammers, they have an iPhone, and then they have another iPhone for backlighting their pictures. It's just eat your food. I had family that had just come back. They took my recommendation. I used to love going to the Amalfi Coast every summer when I lived in London.
Yeah,
it was so easy. So I had just recommended some family go there. They came back and said it was miserable. Everyone's just taking Instagram pictures. You go to Mount Vesuvius or Pompeii, just Instagram. No one's actually there to appreciate.
No one's experiencing the moment.
Destroying the world.
Well, it is, because it takes you out of the moment completely, and you're hovering above yourself. You never live.
Yeah, that's actually why I qualify in that. I think, and this was a few years ago, but I had said take pictures, but with a camera.
Yeah, and don't post. I've never taken one in my life, so I wouldn't know. Now, I'll admit I think I describe them as wise because I agree with them. But I have to say this out loud: learn how to fly fish and how to play backgammon.
Fly fishing is the best. I mean, can you think of a better form of therapy? I know I'm preaching to the choir.
You are preaching to the choir, yes. But backgammon, I mean, fly fishing's gotten increasingly, unfortunately, mainstream, but backgammon's like some weird Egyptian game. Like, what is
It's the oldest board game in the world. If chess is the game of kings, backgammon is the game of pharaohs.
I've played all my life, and I still play, and I love it. But it is a
game.
very esoteric game, relatively speaking. What is it about backgammon?
Every game is unique, for the most part. I mean, by definition, obviously that is true because, computers can beat a human in chess. Computers can't beat a human in backgammon. Too many possibilities. They've yet to develop a computer that can beat a human in backgammon consistently.
Really?
Yeah, that's true. The thing I like about backgammon, and we talked a little bit about this, when you win, it's skill, and when you lose, it's bad luck. So I think that is kind of it adds an addictive element to
There's always an
wanting
out.
to continue playing. And I like it. I mean, it's a social game. Anybody can play it, young, old. You can talk or drink while you're playing. It doesn't suck you in like chess does, or require. It's not as demanding as chess. And the average game is just a couple minutes. I can play it for hours. I do play it for hours.
So do I. Are you married to a backgammon player?
No, I'm not.
That's probably for the best, I would say. Not good for your marriage. Do not use an electric razor.
That's a no-brainer.
It is a no-brainer, no explanation needed.
Grow up.
Here's one that actually hurt my feelings, but I know you're right, so I'm just going to say it out loud.
It's colorful socks.
I don't wear socks, but this one is dessert is for women.
Yeah.
That's true, isn't it?
Isn't it? You go to a restaurant? Yeah.
I eat dessert. I mean, as you can probably tell, I'm a dessert eater. I shouldn't be doing that. And when you said it's for women, I thought, I need to hear that.
But also, there's a romantic component to that, right? Like you're supposed to, you're at a restaurant with a wife or a girlfriend or a significant other, and for whatever reason, personally or because of society, she's apprehensive. So the whole notion of it's more complex, right? It's like you should be encouraging to, encourage them to order dessert and then share it with them. It's more of a romantic gesture, in my opinion. But also, I think a grown man.
I totally agree. That's why that just, it was a knife.
I mean, if you and I went to dinner and if one of us ordered this, it'd be a bit strange, wouldn't it?
It would. And again, I just needed to hear where I just.
True story. I was in London in banking as an analyst, and it was summertime. Summer lull goes pretty quiet, and I was a very hard worker. So religiously, we would go downstairs to the canteen, grab our lunch, and come back up before our computer fell asleep, which is about 10 minutes. And then we would eat our lunch. There were no long lunch breaks in London. Yeah. One lazy summer day, a colleague of mine convinced me to go sit outside. An occasional sunny day in London, you have to take advantage. Summer day, a lot of our superiors were traveling. We decided to sit outside this lovely Italian restaurant, open in Canary Wharf, the financial district in London, open air restaurant, and we split a tiramisu. One tiramisu, 2 spoons. And that was when the head of fixed income walked by my table, stopped, looked at me, and just shook his head and kept on walking. So I think that
Your
was
boss caught you eating tiramisu.
with 2 spoons.
Yeah.
That was the moment.
If it was my office, you'd be out. You'd be out. I mean, key lime pie, different story. And this final one, which is my favorite, I want you to explain what exactly you mean, but I think I can feel what you mean. Suck it up every now and then, especially for your family. What does that mean?
I think that relates to a lot of things, but it relates to a tweet that I had posted that had been popular, pretty similar in terms of thought process, which was, I leave the Hamptons on Sundays so my kids don't have to.
Yeah.
Life. Right now as we speak, there's somebody having a hot molten rod inserted into an orifice.
Yeah.
Terrible things are happening to billions of people as we speak, and we're sitting here enjoying life. It's not. We should be grateful, and whatever it takes to create happiness for yourself and for your family, you just have to do whatever it takes. I mean, it's not that complicated. I mean, I could, whatever you have to endure for a period of time just becomes a memory or a chemical reaction. I mean, so whether or not I stayed at the Four Seasons last night or slept under a park bench would really, over time, the experience aside, is just a chemical reaction. So it doesn't make a difference. So whatever struggles you're going through, whatever you have to endure, obviously you have to assess if it's worth it for, if it benefits you and your family. And if the answer is yes, then, it's a no-brainer. That's what you have to do and not complain about it.
Yeah, and not complain about it. Suck it up every now and then, especially for your family. John Lefebvre, I appreciate your spending all this time with us.
Well, thank you for having me.
Thank you. Are you kidding? Thank you. And thank you for confirming that Brown is the worst, but nothing's as bad as Goldman. I knew that. I knew that in my heart. But you had superior knowledge, so thank you. Tucker Carlson today is the name of the show. No episode 3 is a week on Fox Nation. We'll see you every weeknight, 8 p.m. on the Fox News Channel.